Hello and welcome. I'm Professor Lukas, and today we'll be looking at the various patterns of development, sometimes known as rhetorical patterns. This information is adapted from Chapter 11, Patterns of Development, in my textbook, College Composition and Reading, Information and Strategies. In this lecture and the next one, we're going to go over 8 patterns of development, including exemplification, cause and effect, process analysis, and more. These patterns of development are basically ways of thinking or methods of communication. Each of them suggests a type of support that you can use in a paragraph. You already use all of these patterns in your lives, as the textbook mentions, since we are all thinking, communicating beings. In essence, in this class, we focus on patterns of development in 2 ways. The first way these patterns can be used is as a method for pre-writing. Knowledge of the patterns of development can be used as a brainstorming method for coming up with ideas for your supporting paragraphs, or as a way of exploring and further developing ideas you already have. The other way we can use these patterns of development is as methods for revision, adding material and/or shaping your use of the patterns for maximum efficiency. Because while we do use them unconsciously all the time, if we're conscious of what we're doing, we can be more artful and effective in how we do it. The good news is that these patterns of development can make your paper both longer and stronger, since adding relevant support does both. This video lecture will go over 4 of the 8 patterns of development that will be discussed, with part 2 covering the other 4. In this lecture, we'll cover the following 4 patterns of development. First, we will look at description, or using words to evoke the 5 senses. Next, we'll examine narration, which is the art of storytelling. Then, we will move on to exemplification, which is just using examples. Finally, the last pattern discussed in this video will be cause and effect, which examines how actions and events are related to each other. In the next video, we will discuss the other 4 patterns of development. Without any further ado, let's begin with the first pattern, description. Description is using words to create a mental image and is a pattern often used in conjunction with others. Helping your reader create a mental image can lend power to your writing by making it more lifelike and vivid, by drawing the reader in and engaging their interest and emotions, and by influencing the reader's perception of the object being described. In using description well, you basically need to be able to do 3 things. First, observe the thing being described. Obviously, you can't describe it if you aren't familiar with it. However, more important is selecting relevant details while leaving out distracting, irrelevant, or superfluous details so your description stays focused and achieves what you want it to. The final step is to create your description, including the details you've selected from your observations. You should describe them well and have details that fit together coherently. But how do you know which details are the most important to include? By considering your dominant impression. Your dominant impression is the aspect of your description that you're trying to emphasize, though that isn't necessarily the most obvious or stereotypically important aspect. In the textbook, I give the following example about various ways you might describe your grandparents' house. To emphasize how old and worn it was, you could describe the sagging porch, the musty smells, and the sound of the wind whistling through the windows and cracks during a storm. To emphasize how much fun you had there, you could describe the big box of toys in the living room, the deliciousness of the meals you ate at the table, the feeling of the banister as you slid down it. To emphasize how historic it was, you might discuss the architect who designed it and describe unique features or remnants from the past, like a giant backyard, an old telephone that was being rented from the telephone company, narrow staircases, or the outhouse out back. Basically, You need to keep your purpose in mind and be selective about only including details that help you achieve that purpose. This relates to selection, slanting, and charged language, which we discussed in Chapter 5 on understanding and remembering. Basically, the most effective descriptions use selection of facts and charged language, language with connotations, to create the desired effect in the reader. However, balance is important. You don't want so many details that your reader is overwhelmed or confused about the point, but you don't want so few that your description is ineffective either. There are many different detail types, a few of which are listed in your textbook, but I want to emphasize two in particular: abstract versus concrete. Abstract language is conceptual and is often based on ideas or concepts rather than facts. Abstract words give the reader a general impression, whereas concrete words, specific, descriptive words, help the reader to grasp the particulars. It is often useful to start with a more abstract description, for example, saying the dress is beautiful, and then follow with concrete information, for instance, details about the color, fabric, fit, and so on. Moving from abstract to concrete is a useful strategy in introductions, conclusions, and body paragraphs. Finally, one good way to make your descriptions more vivid, engaging, and effective is to make sure that you're involving more than just one of the senses. People naturally gravitate towards sight, describing how something looks. But if you want your reader to really get involved, you don't want them to feel like they're looking at it through bulletproof glass. You want to make them feel like they are right there. This means using several, if not all, of the 5 senses: sight, hearing, taste, smell, and touch, which includes any physical sensations. To see how this works, let's examine the example description given in the textbook. I had a great dinner. Notice how vague and general this description is. Great is a very abstract term. As I mentioned earlier, it can be useful to start with an abstract term to give your reader a general idea or concept, but you should follow it up with concrete detail to show what you mean. Let's look at a description with more concrete, specific detail. I had a delicious dinner of spaghetti with hot, steaming, spicy red sauce, filled with soft, juicy meatballs, and topped with just the right amount of tangy Parmesan cheese. The smell of the sauce reminded me of an Italian restaurant, with red and white checkered tablecloths over wooden tables, quiet violin music, and flickering candlelight. The chewy, sweet French bread, lavished with butter, complemented the spaghetti perfectly, cooling my mouth and clearing it for the next bite of garlicky sauce. Where do we see the senses being used here? And it's obvious how much more interesting and persuasive this is. It really was a good dinner. One way you can try and create more vivid descriptions is by replacing your verbs and nouns with more specific ones and adding adjectives and adverbs. For example, if you wrote, "The tree moved in the wind," you could replace tree with a more specific word. What kind of tree is it? And add description words. Was it young, old, slender, gnarled, tall? You could replace moved with a more specific action. Did it bend, shake, vibrate, dance? And you could describe the wind. Was it gusty, violent, gentle, harsh? Did it smell a certain way? One of the most common ways description is used is as part of a story or narration, illustrating how these categories can often overlap in actual usage. As with the other patterns, the primary focus in narration is to make sure that you have a purpose in telling the story and make your choices of selection, sequencing, etc. with that purpose in mind. Humans are storytelling creatures, and telling stories comes naturally to us. That makes it easy to get carried away with telling the story, including all kinds of details just because they happened and not because they're relevant. If any of you's ever heard a story told by a 5-year-old, you know why this isn't the best way to go. Your reader is bored and confused before you ever get to the part that was why you were telling the story in the first place. My mother is also guilty of this. She'll say, "I ran into so-and-so at the store today. You know, Sam's mother. Did you hear about his new job? She's so proud. Anyway, I saw her today. Oh, and she was wearing the cutest outfit." And on and on. And 10 minutes later, it finally comes to light that the point was that the woman suggested a new dish to try for dinner that we're having tonight. So again, it comes back to being concise and focused, especially when using narration in an essay. It is merely supposed to be the I, or information, of the pie paragraph, so the story shouldn't even be a full paragraph long. Some other tips that can help your narrations be more effective include using the lessons of slanting through selection of facts and charged language to make sure that your readers get out of your story what you want them to. You aren't expressing everything that happened. You're shaping the story and experience to emphasize a particular aspect, what the story is supporting or proving. For example, when describing a bad day, you'll linger over your description of the negative things that happened, using heavily negative words and lots of description, but will likely not mention any good events at all, like if you found a quarter on the street. Your use of language can be very important as well. Just as with description, you often want to include several of the senses to draw the reader into the story, and you should select your verbs carefully. Also, you want to make sure that the progression of the story is clear, using transitions and making sure readers know what order the events happened in, usually by sticking to chronological order. You also need a clear introduction so the reader knows why the story is being told. Often, the topic sentence in the paragraph will serve this purpose. The most common type of narrative that would be used in an academic essay is the anecdote, a short, direct story, more than a more extended retelling. Remember, keep it short and focused. The point is not to tell everything, but to prove your point or otherwise accomplish your purpose. Again, the main idea to keep in mind is to stay focused on the purpose you're trying to achieve by telling the story. Include details that help that purpose or are needed for understanding, and leave out any that don't help the story accomplish its purpose. Stories often serve as examples of particular points, illustrating and supporting the claim, again, showing the overlap between categories in actual usage. You might use description in a narrative that is acting as an example. Examples are one of my favorite patterns because they are easy and effective. Nothing helps the reader understand more than an example, which is one reason I have so many. For example, and notice how I'm using examples right now and how much it helps you. For example, this passage is from a student's research essay and shows how compelling an example can be. The three strikes law has produced some extreme cases of injustice. For example, one man was sentenced to 25 years to life for stealing a $9 video because he had 2 prior convictions from 30 years previous. This example of the consequences creates a much bigger impact on readers and is much more effective than just saying some sentences are unjust. One reason examples are so helpful is because they translate general and abstract concepts into concrete illustrations the reader can picture in their minds. Remember in description that I encouraged you to begin with abstract or general information and then get more specific with concrete details? Well, an example is a great way to get more specific. Examples are extremely effective, not only because they make things concrete and easy to imagine, but well-used example help to keep the reader interested and clarifies for easy understanding. Make sure to tailor your examples to your audience. A good example that the reader can relate to is an excellent way to connect with your audience. Like I used an example from a research essay on this slide for my class full of English students. Interesting examples shine a spotlight on your point and keep your reader engaged. Now, when people think about examples, they tend to think of actual, real examples that have happened to them. However, this is far from the only type. There are many places to get real examples, a few of which are listed here on the slide, such as online sources or assigned readings. Not only do examples not have to be something that happened to you personally, they don't even have to be something that happened at all. An important and effective tool that you shouldn't overlook is hypothetical examples. While they aren't real, they are realistic. A hypothetical example is something people could easily imagine happening in real life. While they don't pack quite the punch of an actual example from real life, hypothetical examples have the advantage that you can choose and shape them as you please. For example, see how I'm still using it? For an essay arguing for same-sex marriage, I might say, imagine if one member of the couple who has been together for over 20 years falls ill and is hospitalized. Without legal same-sex marriage, their partner wouldn't be considered family and would not be allowed in to see them. The person could die without having a chance to say goodbye to their life partner. Notice that I didn't try and fake like it was a real story or make up names. It is clear it's a hypothetical example, and yet it gives a compelling reason why my argument should be heeded. Metaphors and similes, comparisons, either direct or using like or as, can also be powerful tools, since as we've already learned, our brains work by making connections. Saying something like, "That used car salesman was a total pig," or "My husband is a real teddy bear," gives others a mental picture as well as an overall idea of the qualities of the people you're discussing. Romeo says, "Juliet is my sun and moon and stars," letting us know how important she is to him. She is all the sources of natural light in his world, and without her, it would be cold and dark. Using like or as turns the comparison from a metaphor into a simile and can also impart additional impact on what you're saying. If you're saying you're cold, that's one thing, but to say you feel as cold as an icicle in Antarctica has much more impact and gives your reader something to imagine that makes them really feel that cold. There's a reason that so many sayings that have been around long enough to turn into cliches are similes, such as drop like a rock, and that is because they're effective. We'll talk more about these when we discuss comparison and contrast. However, with any use of exemplification, you always want to keep your audience in mind, thinking which examples would be the most familiar, clear, and convincing to them. Remember to stay focused on the point and be selective about what details you include. I didn't mention what disease the same-sex partner was suffering from because it didn't matter to my point, the potential unfairness and inhumanity inherent in denying two people the right to a government-sanctioned union. Watch out. Perhaps the greatest trap in writing is that your means don't lead to an end. What you end up with is a string of examples that don't lead anywhere. All of your examples can be thoroughly developed, but if they are not supporting an assertion or argument, then they're not connected to the thesis, and you need to make some changes. Again, patterns can be used to make essays longer and stronger, and adding examples is an easy and excellent way to do this, as long as the examples are specific and clear, relevant to the point you're trying to support, and are engaging to the reader. Striking, interesting, surprising, funny, and so on. Keep these qualities in mind when trying to come up with or choose examples. Comparison is an extremely strong tool since, as we've discussed before, the brain works via connections. We learn and understand by connecting to things that are familiar to us. And so, making an explicit connection or comparison to a more familiar or concrete concept can be extremely helpful. For example, look, there's examples again. When discussing abstract or unfamiliar concepts, teachers often rely on analogies, which are a type of comparison. For instance, professors discussing the behavior of electricity often liken it to water, since they have many similarities and we're all familiar with the behavior of water. Comparing and contrasting two things helps us to understand them both better and is commonly used to help us make decisions. This facet can be used in essays as well. For example, comparing the policies proposed by one political candidate to those proposed by the other, and possibly comparing their probable effects, might persuade a reader to vote for the candidate you favor. There are a few things to keep in mind when writing comparisons. One is that you can't compare two things unless they have something in common. In order to stay focused, you should have a basis for comparison, a fairly broad, common characteristic that you can focus on. This basis should relate to your purpose for the comparison. Within that basis of comparison, you'll develop your comparison by finding broad points of comparison, specific points or elements within that broad characteristic. You should avoid stating the obvious just because it's a comparison. Only mention characteristics that matter to the point you're trying to make. It's also important to use clear transitions so that your reader doesn't get confused about which of the two things being compared that you're currently discussing. There are some classes and situations where you might write an entire essay or other expository work that is a comparison. If you're planning to use comparison and contrast as the basis of a thesis statement or topic sentence, it will likely be one of the following: that one is better or worse than the other, which is the most common type. You also might argue that they seem very different but are actually quite similar, or that they seem very similar but are actually quite different. Or, another common one, that their differences and similarities show something important, useful, or significant. One of the most common uses of comparison is through an analogy. Again, comparison and contrast can be used to emphasize a point, illustrate an idea, or make something abstract concrete. Let's look at an example to see how this works. Again, examples are going to help my reader or listener understand. An example given by blogger Kathy Hadley stated that a psychologist teaching stress management raised a partially filled glass of water and asked how heavy the glass of water was. People called out various guesses. She replied, "The absolute weight doesn't matter. It depends on how long I hold it. If I hold it for a minute, it's not a problem. If I hold it for an hour, I'll have an ache in my arm. If I hold it for a day, my arm will feel numb and paralyzed. In each case, the weight of the glass doesn't change, but the longer I hold it, the heavier it becomes. The stresses and worries in life are like that glass of water. Think about them for a little while and nothing happens. Think about them a bit longer and they began to hurt. Think about them all day long and you will feel paralyzed, unable to do anything." She then talked about the need to let go of your stressors. She said, "As early in the evening as you can, put your burdens down. Don't carry them throughout the evening and all night. Remember to put that glass down." By comparing stress to a glass of water, the speaker makes a real impression and helps to make an abstract idea into something concrete. In fact, many motivational speakers who are addressing abstractions such as stress, love, or bullying will make analogies because they're so powerful. Motivational speaker Travis Brown uses a comparison as well. At one point during his speech, he takes out a $100 bill and asks people if they want it, and they do. Then he crumples it up and stomps on it. Then he asks the crowd if they would still want it, which is answered with a resounding yes. It was a demonstration of how things, and more importantly, people, have value, even if they've undergone trials or aren't picture perfect. In another example, a couple were arguing about custody. The woman said that since she gave birth to the child, she should have custody. The father asked the judge, When you put a coin in the soda machine, does the soda belong to you or the machine? While his logic is faulty, since people are not machines and have rights, his analogy can make his position seem much more reasonable to someone who isn't thinking critically. One last example is a quote by Goy Nasu. An entire sea of water can't sink a ship unless it gets inside the ship. Similarly, the negativity of the world can't pull you down unless you allow it to get inside of you. This is much more effective and powerful than just saying, "Don't let it get to you." There are actually many ways that you can use analogies in essays. For instance, in an essay about gay marriage, you could compare the current treatment of homosexuals with the past treatment of people of color or other minorities, or the gay marriage debate with the attitudes towards biracial marriage 50 years ago. Comparing discrimination based on sexual orientation to racism is a powerful comparison and argument for the inherent immorality of that discrimination. You could also contrast how homosexual and heterosexual couples are treated, or how married and unmarried couples are treated, or contrast the stated aims of the USA, like freedom for all and the idea that we're a melting pot, with current discriminatory behavior. So then, when comparing, think about the aspect that you want to emphasize and think what embodies that. Don't think only of obvious comparisons. The glass of water is not obvious at all. If you want to say that something was embarrassing, say, "I felt like I was making a speech in front of my crush with drool running down my chin and my pants falling down." Again, comparisons are very powerful because of the way our brains work. Association. This image with all of the different aspects of being embarrassed. A speech, your crush, drool, being pantsed, really hammers home the impression of mortifying embarrassment. One final point about comparison is how you arrange it. There are two basic methods. One method is block organization, where you state all the relevant qualities or characteristics of one and then switch and discuss all the characteristics of another. This can be a useful method if you don't have very much to say, just one or two relevant characteristics for each. However, it should be avoided in a longer comparison, since it basically makes the reader do the work of making the actual comparison themselves, since you're essentially providing a list of characteristics, and the fact that the matching characteristics of the two types aren't discussed together makes it more of an effort to see how they differ or how they align. In the case of longer comparisons, it's better to do a point-by-point comparison. For example, if you were comparing attending a 4-year college versus beginning at a community college, you would compare their pricing directly. You might talk about the quality of education for one, and then the quality of education for the other. You might talk about the cost of living at a 4-year versus attending community college in another paragraph. This way, each point of comparison is made clear, and the reader is directly shown how the same aspect in the two subjects compare to each other. Before we finish discussing comparison and contrast, let's take one more look at how comparison can be a powerful argument. This comic depicts a religious figure and a regular man discussing something, with the monk saying things like, "Your choice of lifestyle is an abomination," and the man saying things like, "But who am I hurting by being this way?" that make you think they're talking about homosexuality, but in the end, it's revealed that they are discussing being left-handed. These days, everyone knows that being left-handed is a genetic trait that a minority of the population has that is both natural and harmless. This comic is arguing that being a homosexual is also natural and harmless, and that it's just as ridiculous to object to it as it is to object to being left-handed. The analogy is even stronger because this really was the way that being left-handed was regarded hundreds of years ago. So then, what do all of these patterns of development have in common? What's an important focus, no matter which pattern you're using for it to be effective? Focus on your purpose and be selective about what you include in order to achieve that purpose. I invite you to consider how you might use description, narration, examples, or comparison in your future writing. However, for now, this video is wrapping up. I invite you to check out part 2 in the series about patterns of development, which will cover the other 4 major patterns: classification, cause and effect, definition, and process analysis. Thank you for joining me in this discussion of 4 of the 8 main patterns of development. Please don't hesitate to contact me with any question you might have about the material. I am always happy to help.